Well, I hope you can forgive me that I did not have time to change out of my work clothes today. That may not matter to any of you, but in case it does to some of you, my apologies. Far more important than dress is the question that we seek to answer. What is the good life? It's a simple question, perhaps even a prosaic one that doesn't seem terribly exciting, but it's a very important question. It's important because of how many ways that question could be answered. It's important because ideas have consequences. And as someone else added to that phrase, and I don't know who to credit, ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. So questions like this one, what is the good life, turn out to be deeply important. And the way we answer this question and the way we go about orienting our lives around it, we're sort of finding our way in the world. And we're presenting, we are proposing with our words and our lives a way to be, a way to live, a way to do life. So, yeah, how we answer this question matters a lot. Now, I want you right now to consider two vastly different moral visions, two vastly different ways of answering the question, what is the good life? This one you will all know well. Proverbs 3, beginning in verse 5, says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones." Who in this room does not want healing? Who does not want refreshment? Well, what we have here is a biblical vision of the good life. And it tells us how we can get there, healing and refreshment. And it begins by trusting the Lord. And by definition, and to trust in the Lord means that we cannot be wise in our own eyes. Now, consider this vision, this answer to the question, what is the good life? This comes from a famous atheist intellectual by the name of Christopher Hitchens. We believe with certainty that an ethical life can be lived without religion. I'll just pause here. He's right. I have no bones to pick with that particular statement. You don't have to believe there's a God to be moral. You don't have to be religious to have a moral code. But there is, it turns out, going to be a discussion about how important it may still be to have. But before we get to that, let's let Hitchens finish. And we know for a fact that the corollary holds true, that religion has caused innumerable people not just to conduct themselves no better than others, but to award themselves permission to behave in ways that would make a brothel keeper or an ethnic cleanser raise an eyebrow. As I write these words, people of faith are in their different ways planning your and my destruction and the destruction of all hard-won human attainments that I've touched upon. Religion poisons everything. It's a vastly different answer to the question, what is the good life? And I hope you picked up on this. These two visions that I've just presented to you, Proverbs 3, Christopher Hitchens, are not just different, they're opposite. They both say that what is true and what is false, the other one. Proverbs 3 says, "Trust in the Lord, do not be wise in your own eyes." Christopher Hitchens says, religion's Not just not true, it's the worst. It poisons everything. So not only do they provide these differing moral visions, they provide polar opposite answers to the question. And logic would demand they cannot both be true. Now, consider this famous quote. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That was a quote made famous by MLK, although he himself was quoting the late Theodore Parker, who was a 19th century abolitionist. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's a kind of belief that history is the story, that it's got its ups and downs. We can all say, yes, we live in reality. There have been some real lows in history. But if you follow, there's not just a cycle that goes on repeat. There's a line that cuts through, and it gets somewhere, and it's getting somewhere good. We're moving in the right direction. Slow, hard, but it bends towards justice. And so it kind of asserts that progress is kind of inevitable. Even though we might have setbacks, and they can be long and hard, eventually we're going to get there. It's very positive. And so I want you, in light of this very famous quote, think about like the standard progressive and conservative dialogue on this. If I ask a progressive, is this statement true? That the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, they have to say yes. Because it really is articulating the progressive worldview that, yes, it bends towards justice. We're making progress. And so instinctively, in this, like we're locked in this battle where we can't ever throw a bone to the other side, a conservative will want to tear down this idea and say it's not true. And in fact, I've seen this in a lot of the dialogue. A conservative will push back against a progressive who really likes this idea and will say, oh yeah, but look at this, look at this, look at this. And it ends up being a kind of going back and forth of curated facts. You know, if you are committed to the view that it's getting good, getting better, you can find the evidence to support your claim. And if you're committed to the idea that it's getting worse, you can find the evidence to support your claim. It's the cherry picking that is the real deceptive practice involved. And both sides do it. Now, I think you all know me well enough to know that I'm not a progressive. So you might want to, assume that maybe I would be on this side of maybe wanting to poke a few holes in this statement that the arc of the moral universe is long but bends towards justice. Well, actually, my answer is yes, I believe it. But I'm not all that interested in whether or not that statement is true, so much as I'm interested with whether or not, I'm not interested in whether or not it's true. I'm looking at it going, why is it true? That's the question that interests me. Now, I led with this already last week, so you know where I stand. And if you're in this room, you agree with me likely. We're here in this room, in a church, because we believe that in the end, Jesus wins, right? There's no better justice than that. So in some sense, we all agree. Could we just agree, say amen, praise Jesus, hallelujah, call it a day? Yeah, we could do that. And there's actually a time and a place for that. It seems to me that something's going on in our culture, and that a lot of people who are very disillusioned, disenchanted, are maybe getting a little bit sensitized to the Christian story and the gospel. And that's, sometimes I can get really excited by that development. Sometimes I can be really cynical about that development and wonder what's beneath the surface. Is this some sort of, a deception of some kind? But it seems, there's all these people who are not committed followers of Jesus, at least not yet, who are perfectly willing now to go out in public and stake their reputation on it, write massive books on it, do lectures, write the books, do the the lecture circuit and all that stuff, to say that Christianity is the most influential idea that the world has ever known, and that's a good thing. And I look at that and I go, yeah, you're right. So it's not like those who don't agree with that idea are just going to accept defeat and move on. In fact, they're more passionate, more animated than ever to double down and make sure that we don't buy into this lie, the myth of Christianity and its goodness, right? Because they want to stay with Christopher Hitchens. Religion poisons everything. No, we got to get back to that, right? And they feel this as deep in their soul as we feel in ours. So I want to take a look at the evidence, and I want to consider how they might respond. And their answer is going to be, look, so we both agree that the arc of history bends towards justice. I am saying it's because that God is at work in the world, and his plan A is through the church, and that's how he's doing it. And so the best thing for the world is the church. But many of my detractors, my opponents, are going to say, no. You're giving credit to Christianity, what is easily explained by science, or humanism, or reason, or the Enlightenment, or something along these lines. We call this the myth of progress, which is what we're talking about tonight. In coming weeks, over the next couple of months even, we're going to do some dives into history and that kind of a thing, and look at the evidence that advances this idea that I think we sort of already believe, that Christianity is a good thing for the world. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be here. But tonight, I want to give the devil his due, so to speak, and consider this alternative moral vision, this alternative way of answering the question, what is the good life? Is the myth of progress, reason, science, technology, enlightenment sufficient to explain why the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice? Now, we talk about worldview in here a lot, and we often talk about the four components of a worldview. You've got to have an origin, something that explains how we got here and the nature of things. And then you got a problem, and problems need solved. And so in the biblical worldview, we would call this creation, sin, and redemption. And then finally, when played out, when the redemption project reaches its climax, with this picture at the end, consummation or something like that, what is that? Well, we would say it's heaven, it's the new earth, it's the eternal state, it's all these things. The myth of progress has a worldview. And it's generally going to be mechanistic, Darwinistic, something like that in terms of its origin. But it's the middle two that we're really going to see the difference tonight. Not like the first one is not also very different than a biblical worldview, but it's the middle two we're really going to see the differences in how we answer the question about the good life. What we put in the middle, those two slots, is sin and redemption. That when we look out into a world that's broken, when we see depravity, when we see man's inhumanity to man, when we see natural disasters, when we see things as they are, and we're looking for an answer. Why is it that way? We've talked about this before, but we come back to sin, not just the sin of Adam and Eve, but others. There's a whole another talk there, and we've had that talk before, so I won't review it. But in a word, sin is the simple answer to why the world is the way it is. And so the solution is what we call redemption. And it's the whole biblical narrative about how God steps into history, namely through Jesus, the Son of God, Son of Man, as a reconciling agent to bring us to God. We call this redemption. And that is our answer to the question. And so the good life ends up being the end of that redemption project. But in this worldview, in the myth of progress, you just use the common answers of problem and solution. Sin is not a thing, all right? You don't need one word to explain it all. We just have all these unique, atomized, distinct problems, and we just need to solve problems. And so the vision for the end, where we're going, this state at the end, is essentially when we have solved the last of the problems. And oddly enough, the myth of progress and Christianity agree that the last thing that needs to be solved is death. And very often the myth of progress worldview ends up in a transhumanist kind of utopia. And I could quote Harari and a lot of these people, and we've done that before, but they say, look, this is essentially what history is going to do, that through science, through technology, through human ingenuity and humanism, we are going to solve this problem, then this problem, then this problem. And once we've solved the problem of death, we can put all of our resources, all of our good nature to work to do more than just solve problems and figure out how to make life infinitely pleasurable. This is their view for where we're going. Now consider this. Psalm 16. David's writing here. He says, therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. In case you didn't catch this, David agrees with a certain aspect of the myth of progress. He is confident that he's not going to spend eternity in Sheol. He will not see corruption. But in fact, he has a future waiting for him in the presence of God, where there is fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore. And so it seems to me that the biblical dispute with the myth of progress is not the reality of the progress, but the cause of it. A while back, we talked about Judges and Ruth. Judges is it's a dark book, if you understand what it's really getting at. And there's the sin cycle that's just on repeat. Sin. And the consequence of the sin leads to slavery. And then the people will cry out to God. They'll supplicate. And then God will send them a savior. He'll deliver them. Sin, servitude, supplication, salvation, on repeat for hundreds of years. And you have to imagine after 100 years of this cycle, at what point are you maybe in, say, even the supplication phase and go, what's the point even? We'll get our salvation only to what? Fall again and repeat? There's a certain darkness to this cycle. The sense that, are we really going anywhere? A worldview without progress is dark. But Ruth, the book of Ruth, is a very important complement to the book of Judges. It's this lovely story of redemption. But smuggled then at the end of that book is that in the details of the genealogy, we find out in a very technical way how God is at work to make sure that not only is there a cycle, but cutting through this cycle, or maybe this downward spiral, is a line, a moral arc. And it's going somewhere. And we learn in this genealogy that this redemption story is playing out in such a way that the fruit of it will bring us a king. His name is David. And David would be the one who would covenant with God, and with whom God would promise that one day I'll bring a king. There'll be someone on your throne, and he'll take the reins of the kingdoms of this earth. And once he's in charge, his kingdom will never end, and he will rule with perfect justice. All this stuff is a byproduct, progress of this little redemption story that plays out in Ruth after hundreds of years of sin. So in this age of a kind of Christian re-enchantment where some people are kind of opening themselves up to the possibility of a Christian narrative and the role of the church and the society, we don't expect the believers and teachers of the myth of progress to just take it and accept defeat. It's not going to happen. I think that one of the best definitions of this myth of progress comes from Steven Pinker's book, like the title of the book itself as a definition. It's called Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. A few years prior to that, he wrote a book. The title there is The Better Angels of Our Nature. Many of you will recognize this as a quotation of Abraham Lincoln. But even in that, you can sort of see this idea, this worldview idea, the better angels of our nature. There's something that Steven Pinker believes about humanity. He's a humanist. He believes that there's an innate goodness to who we are. And if we would just, lean into the better half of our nature, the myth of progress will work out. It's interesting. He writes these really long books. He's a cognitive science, evolutionary psychologist guy. And it's amazing. He can write a 600-700 page book and people, they will fork over the money and pay for these kinds of things. So if you're writing a really big book, really laying out your worldview, you want to maybe try to give people sound bites. And the way a lot of people do that is they maybe share a quote or two that they really enjoy or encapsulates what they're trying to communicate. Well, he opens his book with 2 quotes, I think, that very effectively do this. The first one is, "Those who are governed by reason desire nothing for themselves which they do not also desire for the rest of humankind." Did you catch this? Those people who are like me, we are of such a good nature, that this progress that we desire, it's not just for us. We want to share it with the world. We're such good people. We want to share this with the rest of humankind. And then he follows this up with a quote by David Deutsch. "Everything that is not forbidden by the laws of nature is achievable, given the right knowledge." So in just curating these quotes and putting them out there for the reader to think about and ponder as the opening salvo of his book, he's saying, this is the way. Because our way is good, our way is progress. We're good people, us scientists, us reasonable people. And as long as we operate within the laws of science itself, whatever you can dream, we'll get there. I mentioned Harari, Noah Yuval Harari, a couple minutes ago. One of his books, it was titled Homo Deus. Essentially what he's saying is, I don't believe in God. God doesn't exist yet. He will one day when we make him, or maybe better yet, when we become him. No more Homo sapiens, but Homo Deus. In his book, Live Not by Lies, Rod Dreher has I think, a pretty succinct summary of the myth of progress. The Puritan ideal was to use freedom to live by virtue. And the distinction here, virtue, value, is important. Values are subjective. Virtues are objective. So Rod is drawing on that fact here at the very beginning. The Puritan ideal was to use freedom to live by virtue. That is an external standard of righteousness. And he even says, as defined by Christian scripture. The modern, so contrary to that, the modern American ideal is to use freedom to achieve well-being, as defined by the sacred individual. So not out there, but in here. That is the self. that is fully the product of choice and consent. The myth of progress teaches that science and technology will empower individuals unencumbered by limits imposed by religion and tradition to, this is key, realize their desires. In the myth of progress, what is the chief end of man? It's to look inside yourself, identify your deepest of desire, and bring it to life. This is the myth of progress. And remember what Proverbs 3 said? Trust in the Lord, lean not on your own understanding, do not be wise in your own eyes. You know, it seems to me that what Rod Dreher is saying here in his summary of the myth of progress is this. Here's what the myth of progress is all about. Eat the fruit. Eat the fruit. I don't understand why you haven't already. Oh, because some God that imprisoned you here told you you couldn't? You know why, right? That's because if you take that fruit, you'll become God. You'll be like him. You'll be a rival to him. And he can't have that. So, look at that apple. It's pretty. Looks good, doesn't it? It's pleasing to the eye. It would nourish your body, wouldn't it? So it's good to look at. It'll taste great. Be good for your body. You know you want it. Eat the fruit. Well, I want to offer a little bit of a summary and critique of, I guess, the myth of progress generally, but also to some extent Steven Pinker specifically. I did read Enlightenment Now. I read the entire thing. So you wouldn't have to, you know. I mean, you're certainly free to do that, but it'll take a little while. I can say a couple of good things about it. It's generally optimistic, and I do think he does a good job of exposing a kind of negativity bias in our culture. This is a real problem, and I think some of us, maybe in this very room, need to deal with this. You know, like they say about the news, if it bleeds, it leads. This is true. We are addicted to rage and anger and the feelings of injustice. And a lot of times what we do is we nurture those feelings. And the internet knows this too. You know, algorithms, right? They will play off this, all right? They will give you what you want. And every time you click a rage video or something like that, all right, the internet goes, oh, you like getting mad. So let me show you some more things to make you upset. Right? And so what happens is our eyes, what we take in, what we listen to, it becomes overwhelmingly skewed towards the negative. And Steven Pinker exposes this is a flaw, perhaps, in us. This is something that we need to work on. The facts are pointing to something else. And so a lot of what he does in his book is just bombard you with good news, right? The gospel according to science. And there are a lot of reasons to celebrate that we live in 2025. There are things that we can be happy about. There are things that we can rejoice in, and things that we can be thankful for. He uses, I think, around 75 or more maps and charts and things of the sort, really illustrating the progress that we're making. And some of you might need to dabble in some positive space, and I think that could be helpful. And he does that well. Another thing I do appreciate, it's quite obvious as you read, he hails from the political left. But at a few key points, I think he's able to put some space between himself and the extreme left. So I appreciate just a little bit of moderation. And I appreciate that among conservatives when they can do the same thing too. Showing you that you can think and leave the silo a little bit, that's good. And that tells me you're someone that I'm interested in talking to. You're not just a company man, so to speak. So I appreciate that. Now, let's talk about the ideas of the book. Early on the book, I think he really lays out the worldview implications of the myth of progress. And I think it's chapter 2. It's called Intro, Evo, Info. This is short for entropy, evolution, and information. And what he's doing there, entropy, he's essentially identifying as fact the second law of thermodynamics, which explains that the natural state of things is towards disorder, not disorder. And for a simple statistical reason. There are infinitely more ways for something to be disordered and chaotic than ordered. And it's really just a statistical problem. The entropy is not some force or power in the cosmos. It's just the way the math works. And so this is sort of what he identifies as like original sin. It's what's wrong with the world, right? It's the fundamental problem. And it's like he would say, it's not just one problem. Entropy it comes close to describing that, but it's this problem, then this problem, then this problem. And so the solution, how do we overcome entropy, the natural descent into chaos? It's two things. So this is, the redemption part of his narrative. It's evolution and information. The way he explains evolution, there's a kind of self-interest involved, and so that this natural selection, the mechanisms of evolution, there is something of a self-interest involved, and this helps overcome some of that statistical probability and information. So if we're sort of armed with both of these things, if we get enough information and we exercise humanistic self-interest, eventually these two things are going to help us overcome one problem, then another, and this is how we avoid the descent into entropy. And so what he does is he just bombards you, like I said, with an overwhelming amount of information proving his case. And he's sort of saying, look at all the good things that are happening in the world. And then what he does is he gives credit to all those good developments to evolution and information, science, enlightenment, reason, technology, these kinds of things. The fact of the progress is right there in front of you. Like I said, the real question in my mind is, what's the explanation for it? So he's bending over backwards to try to prove to you that not only are we is the bend towards justice, towards progress, but that science is the best way to explain it. Now, if this is true, if he's right, think about this. If things are getting better because of science, because of reason and technology, humanism, then maybe instead of saying in God we trust, we should say in genius we trust. Right? If these are our tools, then maybe we should just let the smartest among us, the most evolved, and the ones with the most information, let them control the direction of society. Let them answer the question about how to live the good life, right? I mean, this would naturally follow. And of course, if that's true, if in genius we trust, then why don't we just make sure that all the smartest people are running all of our businesses and all of our politicians? So if we go from in God we trust to in genius we trust to, in government we trust. And when has that ever been a problem? Now, this is not what he's advocating. I'm asserting that this is an implication of his view. He says, and we have all these reasons, great reasons to be optimistic. In chapter 8, he says something that stuck out to me. He says, in light of all this progress, maybe we should have a shift in our cultural understanding of the summum bonum. That's a Latin phrase. It means the highest good. And this is where he sort of really exposes his worldview. He says, we should have a shift of the summum bonum. Instead of being the question, how can I be saved, as the highest good? How about this one? How can I be happy? You remember? Eat the fruit. Steven Pinker, chapter 8 of Enlightenment Now, essentially tells us that the highest good is to answer the question, how can I be happy? Eat the fruit. Now, one of the problems that I see in this book is the cherry picking. And his opponents do the same thing, like I've described, is that nauseating debate between progressives and conservatives. Progressives who believe we're heading in the right direction are going to curate history and facts to prove their point. Conservatives who are sitting around waiting for a rapture are going to curate the facts and history and try to say, well, no, actually things are getting worse. And it's really annoying, I'll be honest. But he does this. I think there's some deceptive framing at the very least involved. Here's an example. At one point he says, well, first I'll say this. There's kind of a standard answer. So when the conservative comes back with, well, yeah, but look at this. Look at all the deaths of the 20th century or something like that. And the go-to answer, as best I can tell, amongst him and other believers in the myth of progress is, well, that is the counter-enlightenment. So they don't want to take credit for it. Anything bad is the counter-enlightenment. Anything good is the enlightenment. That's kind of how this goes. So they just, and honestly, at times it begins to sound kind of arbitrary. Like that's how it works. They're insulated from the truth. If it's good, it's progress. It's my worldview. If it's bad, it's anti. It's counter-enlightenment, and it's that's the answer. If it's good, that's my team. If it's bad, it's that team. And of course, there's a real problem with just looking at all the bad facts, the data, and saying, oh yeah, that's the counter-enlightenment. Well, why? At one point, Steven Pinker actually says, quote, with the exception of the world wars, murder is down. With the exception of the world wars, murder's down. Okay, so if I remove the most significant data point on a technicality, hey man, things are good. So that's kind of one maneuver, and then the other maneuver is the one I mentioned before. Well, the Russian Revolution and Nazism and fascism, all that's counter-enlightenment. Well, the facts would indicate otherwise. Mao, 45, 50 million, maybe more, were killed. You know what their initiative was called? The Great Leap Forward. The extermination of the Jews, the final solution. Hitler's worldview was fundamentally Darwinistic. Pinker wants to tell you that evolution and information is the way we solve problems. That is exactly what Hitler believed. And if you ask a man on the street who's the worst man in history, many will put Hitler as their answer. What was the worst thing that ever happened in world history? World War II. Hitler actually answered this question. He had a different take. He said that the heaviest blow of the 20th century was, quote, Christianity. This filthy reptile raises its head whenever there is a sign of weakness in the state, and therefore it must be stamped on. We have no sort of use for a fairy story invented by the Jews. In other words, religion poisons everything. That's what Hitler just said. There's no bigger believer in the myth of progress than one Adolf Hitler, who believes evolution and information will solve this problem, then this problem, this and this problem. And the final one is the one that will really remake the world. In chapter 18, I think he gives us in pretty straightforward terms his answer to the question, what is the good life? And he answers it with one word: happiness. Or as I've been saying tonight, eat the fruit. That's the good life. Reach out. Take it. I believe that Steven Pinker and many other scientists often, this is one of the problems that we have is scientists, especially philosophical materialists and atheists, try to use science to do things that science fundamentally cannot do. All right, and this is what's called the naturalistic fallacy. But science is very good at is explaining what things are. We would call that ontology. Science can help us explain mechanism, how things work, all that kind of stuff, and that's incredibly valuable. And I'm not anti-science by any stretch of the imagination, but one thing that science cannot do is answer the question of ought, right? It's the is-ought distinction. Science is really good at helping us understand what something is, but it cannot tell us what something ought to be, because that is a moral judgment. Science can't make moral judgments. And so, now I'm not saying that scientists can't be moral, right? I'm not saying atheists can't be moral. But what I'm saying is you have no true authority. What you actually have is just a personal preference. Your vision of a moral world is really just what you like. And there might be some overlap between what you like and what I like. But you can't actually call good good. It's why it's important that in Genesis 1, we have God, the Creator, telling us what is good. He actually has the authority to declare something good or even very good. Because he's not just a scientist. He's a moral lawgiver. And science cannot do that for us. And so I think that Steven Pinker et al. Is guilty of this naturalistic fallacy. There's a bunch of other things I say. I think I'm going to skip ahead and just say this before I move on. I think in the end, his philosophy is incoherent, meaning it doesn't work. It's self-defeating. So keep in your mind, he's a philosophical materialist. And so in the book about how the mind works, he writes, ethical theory, listen to this is crazy. Ethical theory requires idealizations like free, sentient, rational, equivalent agents whose behavior is uncaused. So he's saying free will. In order to do ethics, the very nature of what ethics are, it requires a measure of free will, behavior that is uncaused. Same sentence. And yet, the world, as seen by science, does not really have uncaused events. So what he's saying is, his vision of morality requires something that doesn't exist. So he, in some sense, I'm reading that and I'm going, you just admitted it. You can't say something is good. You can say, I like that. But you can't actually say that something is good. And that is not the purview of science. So how do you make this work? Well, you have to take the ultimate leap of faith. Who's the believer now? And one example of this in his own life is he demonstrates, he really can't authoritatively or scientifically call something even as terrible as infanticide actually wrong. He can wax at length about how detestable he finds it. I mean, I'm not saying he's an immoral being. He's certainly not. So he can have these moral intuitions and commitments and live them out in his life and advocate for them. But actually calling them immoral is what's difficult. A number of years ago, there were a couple of news stories that were similar, and so there was kind of a national discussion going on where these young mothers had literally thrown their babies in trash cans. And Steven Pinker came to the rescue to give us an explanation of this phenomenon from evolutionary psychology. And he told us that we need to understand the teenagers. Try to understand it from their perspective. And maybe with a little help from Darwin. He says, infanticide, this is a quote, infanticide has been practiced and accepted in most cultures throughout our history. Thus, the emotional circuitry of mothers has evolved. A capacity for neonaticide is built in to the biological design of our parental emotions. What he's saying is that young mothers can throw their own babies in the garbage can because of an evolutionary mechanism that was, through most points in history, he's saying, a positive adaptation. Yet he's the one telling us the solution to entropy is what? Evolution and information. But he just said the reason these mothers can throw their babies in the trash is because Darwin put that there. How much sense does that make? I thought evolution was how we overcome entropy. But in fact, even he himself has to admit evolution is how we end up throwing babies in the trash. There was a man who almost wrote a very similar book to this. I say almost because he set out to write a book similar to this. His name is Gunter Levy, a non-Christian, and he wanted to prove the myth of progress and basically say why religion poisons everything. And he ended up writing a book that says, the title of which is Why America Needs Religion. In one key quote, he says this: contrary to the expectations of the Enlightenment, freeing individuals from the shackles of traditional religion does not result in their moral uplift. This is not a believer. This is someone who was persuaded by the evidence. He adds, no society has yet been successful in teaching morality without religion. I want to look at two experiments, which I think get us thinking a little bit, and maybe present us with some evidence against the myth of progress and the failure of the myth of progress. The first one, any of you ever heard of Mouse Utopia? It's kind of the nickname for the experiments. John Calhoun was the primary researcher here. He really dedicated a huge chunk of his life to these experiments. They were done about 30 times. But one of the most famous examples, because it was, I think, the largest of all of them, was in the 60s. And so what he does is he sets up a perfect environment for these rats where they have all their needs met. They're safe from harm. It's climate controlled. Essentially, a progressivist utopia, right? Because what are the progressives always saying? If we can just fix all these problems, if we can make it so that nobody's hungry, that everybody has what they need, all their physical needs, a good relation, whatever. If we can give them the perfect environment, right, because they're basically good, they'll do good. Crime is a result of poverty, not the other way around in this worldview, right? So let's see what would happen if we put a bunch of rats together and gave them the perfect environment. And so they have this one in particular had a carrying capacity of around 4,000, 5,000 rats. So it was large, it was significant. And they started with just 9. They wanted to see what would happen. And this ideal setting at first was seemingly proving the myth of progress worldview, at least in rat world. They were happy. They were mating and producing offspring at a really healthy, positive pace and developing a kind of community that looks like really good. It was this mouse utopia. But eventually, that stopped. And it didn't happen when they got overcrowded. It started to happen when they got to about 50% of capacity. So they still had plenty of room to grow. All their needs were met. But something changed in this rat society. And a suite of behaviors emerged that was labeled the behavioral sink. All right, what happens is this perfect environment over time led to an amount of degeneracy that was pretty astonishing. And one of the first things they noticed was a lot of gender bending behavior. Yeah, I don't know what you're thinking about right now, but this is one of the things that they observed. Okay, so like there was a large group of males, for instance, which came to be known as the beautiful ones. They became pretty isolated, but they were like excessive in like self grooming. They were obsessed with how they looked and isolated. It was strange, the constant preening and that kind of a thing. But it wasn't helping them socially. It was actually making things worse. This is the person who's so image obsessed. It's like, what will they think? That kind of a thing. And the urine samples of the beautiful ones showed that they had just ridiculous levels of stress. They could tell from certain hormones that were produced, even as they're observing. But these rats have no reason to feel that way, right? They're just overwhelmed with anxiety for no really good reason. It's like the perfect environment led them to like craft some kind of anxiety or something. Don't really know. I mean, I'm not a mouse psychologist, and that wasn't what John Calhoun was trying to do. At least I don't believe. Just the behavior, though, itself is observed. Now, on the other side, the females, many of them were becoming noticeably more aggressive, and they abandoned their young at an early age, like too young, before the young were ready to be without their mothers, because they had to go and live their lives, right, and do their jobs and have a career. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, mice, I forgot. But they were doing this behavior. They were abandoning their young to go do their thing. And they spent less time with their families overall. And then another thing that was really interesting is how these rats divided up into 3 social groups. This one group, they were obsessed with social approval, just obsessed with social approval. What do my rat buddies think of me? And one of the kind of bizarre evidences of this is that they would refuse to eat alone, meaning like they would like wait to make sure that everybody else was eating. They weren't being nice or deferential, you understand? They were unsure of themselves. Oh, I wouldn't want to, step out and take the first bite if I'm not supposed to. Like, what will people think if I mess up, right? And so they became paralyzed. They had, they couldn't step out. They couldn't step out and assert themselves. They were apathetic, just because they were obsessed with what will people think. And I, it's like they were insecure in themselves, and they had to make sure that they were nobody would think poorly of them. And then another group, they were referred to as emotionally numb, the numb group. They displayed more of like zombie-like behavior, even preferring to go out at night when the other rats were asleep. So they were isolating themselves from society. They wanted to get away and not be connected, and they were just numb. And then this third group, they became extremely aggressive, committing random acts of violence, sometimes even cannibalism. And they were also very sexually hyperactive, but not actually committed to the offspring or anything like that. They were just going around doing their thing. After 1,700 days, this experiment led to total collapse. The civilization, this mouse utopia where everything was perfect, led to utter degeneracy and entropy. I wonder if maybe this doesn't point to there actually being consequences of success. Or of progress. The myth of progress worldview is right there in the middle. It's got problem, solution. So let's just go through and fix all of our problems. Well, what happens if we solve all of our problems and we've got this, heaven on earth kind of thing that we've made? Well, something like this, if it has any insight into human behavior, might be pointing to something else that maybe having the perfect life, especially when it's one that we've sort of worked to achieve, it can actually contribute to our undoing. You see, well, Christians agree that one day there's a future that waits for us, a new heavens and a new earth, right? We'll be in the presence of God where there's fullness of joy, pleasures forevermore. We don't get there until this redemptive work is being done. You see the difference? It's not just that we rid the world of all the problems until we're infinitely happy. Something fundamentally has to be changed in us because you and I are unfit for perfection. You know, we have to be made perfect. There's something in the biblical worldview that I think fills a massive gap in the myth of progress. You and I would not thrive in a world where everything was handed to us and made perfect. This side of glory, we need a little bit of that pain. We need to be perfected. We need to be made, turned slowly over the long haul into something better and different. You know, let's see, it was Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory. I sing those songs all the time. I think it's one of the last lines of the movie. Willy Wonka turns to Charlie and he says, "Charlie, you know the story about the man who got everything he ever wished for?" Charlie's waiting for the answer and he says, "He lived happily ever after." I wonder if experiments like this, and let's be honest, reality, history, point to the opposite of that statement. What happens to the man who got everything he wished for? Mass utopia, degeneracy, entropy. There's one more thing that I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about this at greater length in a couple of months. And as I was thinking about this topic, it seemed relevant to me. And I think that talking about it a little bit, about it gives us real world, real time evidence. And I think something that really counters the myth of progress. So this isn't a science experiment so much as a social one, or really just a phenomenon. There is an era in our recent history known as the sexual revolution. In a couple months, I'm going to do a whole talk about this. So I'm importing some of that talk into tonight, and I'm going to be very high level. So one thing I should say is that some of what I'm going to say, I have not had the time to nuance and make sure that my words are precise here. So I might say some things that are a little blunter than they should be. And so a couple of qualifications. In general, what I'm talking about here are the long arc, the statisticals, the general principle, not the universal rule, if that makes sense. So I'm going to describe trends that, if they describe any of you in this room, you may be tempted to sort of, maybe you'll want to take offense to something I'm saying. I'm not saying that if this trend defines you, that you yourself are a problem here. This will become clearer in a moment. So some discernment is required. I'm trying to stand back and look at the trends and talk about those trends. I think that the data at that level of observation is really helpful. But I would recognize that there are exceptions. So the sexual revolution was empowered in part by this happiness ethic, right? Which we learned, Steven Pinker and others, at the bottom of the worldview is a happiness ethic. Like, what is your inner desire? Let's solve problems. Let's get rid of those things first. And when we do that, let's find out what that thing is that's inside of you and turn that into reality. Let's eat the fruit. And so the sexual revolution was a very positive spin on this happiness ethic. That, why it's not fair that women don't get to act like men. It feels good for them too. So men, they can just go around doing their thing, and they can leave their woman, leave the children. This is terrible. Women should be able to act like that, and they should be free to feed their appetite and act like men. And at about the same time, two incredible things happened, and these are trumpeted to us by the progressive mythicists and feminists as like the great triumphs of the modern world: birth control, the pill, and abortion. Now, on moral grounds, I don't think there's going to be any great debate in this room about where that should, whether or not that should have a place in our world. But the pill is maybe a little bit different, and I'm not trying to say that it's morally wrong. I do want to step back and go, well, what are the consequences, the unintended consequences of this thing? So here's what happens. We've got this happiness sexual ethic, which just says, find out what you want and satisfy it. And now, through what? Technology and science, right? These are the tools of the progressive mythicists. Through those tools, we are going to make the world fair so that women can have just as much sex as men and not have to suffer the consequences. Because now, let's be honest, let's think about this. Historically, and I say historically, not just recent, throughout human history until very recently, the kind of evaluation process that a woman has to go through before she surrenders her body to a man is really hard to appreciate anymore. There are very few of us who are still alive who can remember that world. If a woman gives her body over to a man for just a few minutes, right? The passion's there, she loves this guy, whatever, and she surrenders to temptation. There's a lot riding on the line. It's a huge risk because she could get pregnant, and if she gets pregnant, her body is going to go through all kinds of transformations as her body, whether she's chosen to or not, is now committed to nurturing this human person so that she can give birth 9 months later and go through the most excruciating, one of, if not the most excruciating pain of her life. And that's just the start of it. Because there is now a biological thing at work. She is the only one who is uniquely equipped to nurture this living person for the first couple of years of its life in most cases. So she's obligated her, she's now 3 years in, right? For 15 minutes, she's now 3 years in. But we all know it doesn't end at 3 years for most people, right? So for most women, that's until adulthood, right? So this is the math that a woman has to do, right, when she's with a man she likes. I might be making a 20-year commitment. I won't be able to feed myself if I've got to feed these babies. I can't just go and become a nurse. Those kinds of things weren't options through most of history. So this man, can I trust him? Right? If we make a baby, is he going to take care of me so I can take care of the baby that we produce? You see what's at stake? So now you've got these incredible birth control procedures. Abortion is one of them, sadly, but also the pill. And so now a woman is in control of her reproduction, which means now she's free because of the tools of science, technology, to act like men. She no longer has to ask this, am I ready to make a 20-year commitment kind of question. So her grid for who I'm going to sleep with, like the standard, it goes way down. And so when women have a cultural myth saying, just feed your desires, and a technology that can prevent the consequences of that union, men everywhere go, yeah! Because the way this also works, if you're a woman living in that world, and that's the math, that's the calculus. If I give my body to this man, he better be a good man, right? But now I don't have to be so worried about that. I can just surrender for one night and enjoy it for what it is. But if that's true, now that man doesn't have to prove to me that he's worthy of it, you see? And so one of the unintended consequences of this progress is that when women give it up, men are more than willing to accept that, and no longer is work involved with becoming a man worthy of sex. And so now the whole crop of men, the quality, the character, the virtue, the strength, even certain elements of self-improvement or how you work on yourself, the standards are down now. This is not good. When women are giving it up, acting like men, and men are no longer motivated to be good, virtuous men. This is destructive, in fact, I'd say. And one of the consequences, another one, is the utter breakdown of the nuclear family. Because women are feeling less obligated to their children, because, I'm going to do me, right? And so one of the consequences now is, so when we look at one-parent families and things of this sort, you see who's suffering now. As a result of this revolution, it's the children. It's the children that get hurt. What about their rights to have one mom and one dad who are committed for life? Think about the safety, the security of knowing that mom and dad are going to be there for me come hell or high water. That's good for a kid. We have this anxiety epidemic in our culture. Well, I wonder why that might be. One of the things that children need is to know that mom and dad are in it for life. And then there's this other really strange, there's this data coming out about the trends in sexual mate selection and things of the sort that are really weird. And many of you know this, but men are having less sex than they used to. And they're having sex for the first time at a much older age than they used to. And the moralists among us might be tempted to go, look, that's progress. Right? Because we believe in a Christian sexual ethic that sex belongs inside the confines of a covenant relationship, of marriage. And so we might be going to go, look at that, that's good, they're waiting. Oh, that's not what's happening. And I would submit that that's actually a bad sign. That's a sign that our culture is getting worse, not better. Because it looks like the reasons these men are having less sex and at a later age, and this is going to sound harsh, it's because they're losers. It was too easy there for a while. When you didn't have to show that you were a man of virtue, that you were a man whose seed was worth bringing into the next generation. This is not good. You play that out over time. See, women have this other instinct in them. It's called hypergamy. And it basically means this. Again, I'm talking about on the whole, statistically, generalities, etc. There are exceptions. Generally speaking, one of the key things that a woman is looking for in mate selection is can this man increase my station in life in an emotionally satisfying way? It's something like that. And whatever else we might say is the answer, what women want or whatever, it's some version of that. Can this man increase my station in life in an emotionally satisfying way? And so now what's happening is there aren't many men who can prove themselves, yes. You unite with me and I will increase your station in life in an emotionally satisfying way. And so what women they just, it's in them. They don't like to date down the social hierarchy, those kinds of things. Statistically, this is true. And so now, because the standard, men's standards have suffered, and there are more losers than ever, or at least so it seems, there's less men who can attract mates. So here's the weird thing that's happening. Women are having more sexual partners than men because there's a small number of men who are getting lots of ladies, right? So we've got this population, just like the mouse experiment. There's this population of males that are sexually hyperactive, while the rest are underactive. This is a sign of degeneracy, of decline, of decay, of entropy. And I believe it's a consequence of the sexual revolution. We haven't even talked about pornography. It's like almost the final nail in the coffin. We're moving in the wrong direction. It's getting easier and easier to not be a man of virtue. And now I can satisfy my urges at the click of a mouse. I mean, it might not be as good as the real thing, but it's enough. It'll do. And this is a recipe for disaster. And so we've got this epidemic of weak, kind of loserish men. And I'm not saying that if you're single, you're a loser. I'm not saying that. But the trend, it's a losing trend for sure. More broken families. We're also having severe population issues, Those experiments that I mentioned, the mouse experiments, they actually grew at the time out of concern for overpopulation. Turns out we're facing the opposite problem. It's not just about the total number. You need to have healthy demographics for society to, progress. You should have, because as people get old, they, die. And if they're reproducing at a healthy rate, you'll have a pyramid structure in terms of your age, how it is put together in your culture. So at the top, the elderly will be small. The next size, they get bigger as you go, and you have this really big, healthy base at the bottom. So as people die, or as they get older and they become more dependent on other people's resources, there's lots of people beneath them to help them out. Well, for the first time in American history, we've got an upside down pyramid, right? We have this population that's aging out, and we don't have a support system. We don't have young people who can replace them. So it also means, to maybe more sentimentally or philosophically, but, the loss of wisdom. We have less pots to put that wisdom into, right? It's important. Like, we are moving in the wrong direction. And when your social demographics are an upside down pyramid, it's a signal of imminent existential crisis. And this could be a real problem for us. So I know we've been going for a while. I think we should wrap this up. Maybe I should have done that a while ago. I want to do this with just a quick reading of a passage of Scripture, with one thing in mind, a contribution from a Christian philosopher that we all know, Augustine. His impact on history cannot be understated. I think some of his impact was negative. I think some of it was positive. This concept, I think, is a pretty positive one, and so I'll leave it with this one. He wrote this book. He had this concept, this contrast of the city of God and the city of man. Tonight we've been contrasting two moral visions, two ways of answering the question, what is the good life? And I might argue that essentially what we've been talking about all night is one vision. We could call it the city of man, the myth of progress. It's even, as one of its core tenets, has humanism as part of it. Or there's the biblical vision for the good life, and that's the city of God. Now, the city of God is not an isolationist mentality. The idea, city of man, city of God, is that when you gratify the desires of the flesh, you're building the city of man. And that's bad. But when you trust in the Lord, when you obey the Lord, when you follow his laws, you're building the city of God. And that's our vision. That's our moral vision. That's our explanation for why the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, because there are Christ followers who are learning more and more, just a little bit, to trust in the Lord, and they are building right here among us the city of God. Now, this is a project that's been going on for almost 2,000 years. As far as my eschatology goes, it's very important, I think, that we embrace this already, but not yet tension. This is a reality. It's here. It's already. But we certainly don't want to commit the crime of putting it in the already camp. We are still waiting. Right? We are waiting for King Jesus to return, for his land to hit the Mount of Olives and to establish a kingdom that will never end. Yes, we're still waiting. But until then, we must rejoice in the present tense reality of the kingdom. Our King is seated on the right hand of the Majesty on high. His kingdom is in session. His priesthood is in session. So I want to wrap it up with this. A few verses. We get a glimpse at the end of the book, Revelation 21 and 22, of what we could call the city of God. Here is our moral vision. What is the good life? The good life, we could say it this way, it's coming. It's the city of God. It's described here in Revelation. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." And he who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." Also, he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." And he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Through the middle of the street of the city, also on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will need no light, nor lamp, or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. Father, we can't wait for that day, but we must. So we wait patiently for you. And in the meantime, Lord, my prayer is that we would be found faithful, that we would be individuals, family members, and church members who are committed to building the city of God right now. That our answer to the question, what is the good life, cannot be answered by looking within ourselves. There's nothing good in there. That we seek to answer the question, what is the good life, by looking to you, the author of life. For that life, we thank you. We ask for your blessing. May you be honored among us. Keep building us up for your glory, Lord. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.